year, this cycle, and on our fourth forum, we divided up and did projects. The people who were interested in trying to come up with solutions divided into 9 different groups, and one group was interested in sustainable funding. And as a result of the deliberations and interviews that we've done in that group, we found out that we really didn't understand how our public schools were being funded. And so, what we're going to do tonight is ask, how are our schools funded, and why the current funding seems to be insufficient to meet the needs of our students. And we further hope to hear about maybe what can be done to make the situation better. I'm going to thank our moderator, Alan Webber, for coming, especially because he has a very busy schedule. He's an entrepreneur, writer, progressive Democrat, who ran for governor in 2014. He now has an organization called Wirth New Mexico, and tries to come up with also good ideas of how to improve the state. In addition, we're grateful for all of our sponsors. We have other congregations who are part of the Interfaith Coalition, Santa Fe Home Builders, and Santa Fe Realtor Association, who help us along the way during the year to put on these forums. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have 2 different sections. First, we're going to hear from our panelists, and each one is going to have 7 minutes to present on a topic regarding funding. After that, we want you, while you're listening to them, to think of questions, write them down. We've passed around index cards and pencils. Use those. We want to hear from you. This is a public forum, and we want everybody to be participating. There'll be 2 members of our group. Can you stand up? Who will be standing up and collecting your index cards, Paul and Mary Alice. And as they collect them, we'll sort through them, and then after the panelists have spoken, they'll answer a selection of the questions. Our second part of this night will be to hear from you, and what we'll do is break into groups of 4 to 6 people. You're going to turn around and talk to each other in a group, and ask yourself, what is it that's been most meaningful tonight? What's been most disturbing, maybe? And what you might have as a suggestion that didn't come from our panelists. So, with that, I think we're ready to start. And Alan, I'll ask you to introduce the rest.
Sure. Do you want me to use that?
And you'll have,
this device?
yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very cogent introduction. We now know the rules of the game, and now we're going to get the game going. I do want to thank the Interfaith Coalition and Temple Beth Shalom and the Santa Fe New Mexican. I am a firm believer that if you want to change the future, you have to change the things we're talking about, and this is about as important a conversation as we could be having. Public education has always been, I think, the ladder of opportunity for people in my lifetime, more so now than ever. And so the question about how we're doing in New Mexico, how we're spending the money, how much money we're spending, whether we should be spending it better, whether we should have more of it, are really the critical questions for the state's future. And education really is the launching pad, the point of departure for conversations about many other things, including our economy and the quality of life in New Mexico. We are very fortunate. I am sitting off to one side so you can focus on the talent on the stage. We have 3 people who actually know something about this subject, which is the beginning point of an informed conversation. Dan Yohalem is a public interest lawyer who has, I think, championed many worthy causes. You've probably seen his name in the newspaper recently about some issues involving food stamps, SNAP payments in New Mexico, and he's been championing that issue. He is a co-counsel with the Center on Law and Poverty and MALDEF to pursue issues of sufficiency in spending for public education. Next to him is Linda Trujillo, former president. The former president, but still member of the Santa Fe Public School Board, and newly about to be elected state representative. She won the primary and is in the enviable position of having no general election, so I think it's safe to assume that she will be in the state legislature and holding on to your public schools responsibility at the same time. And State Senator Peter Wirth, who is a champion of many things, including public education, knows the history of sufficiency studies, how the permanent fund has been allocated, what it means, where it comes from, where it goes. So we'll be looking at the law, the state, and then the schools in a kind of sequential order. So I'm going to ask Dan to kick it off and give us a picture of what the sufficiency lawsuit is, what the issues are in front of the court, and in 7 minutes, everything we need to know about this overarching issue of public expenditures in New Mexico.
I feel like Usain Bolt.
I did.
So in 2014, the Center on Law and Poverty, a public interest law firm in Albuquerque, contacted me and several others to work with them on a lawsuit concerning public education funding in New Mexico. And the center was concerned that parents from many school districts around the state had come to the center to talk about the fact that their kids, low income or English as a second language, these kids were falling farther and farther behind in school. And over several years, the center put together a lawsuit, and in 2014, Wilhelmina Yazzie versus the state of New Mexico was filed. And it was filed in Gallup. And the plaintiffs in that lawsuit are 20 children from districts around the state, and I'll tell you who they are in a minute, and the parents of those children. And also several school districts joined with them as plaintiffs in that lawsuit. And usually you hear about school districts being defendants, the school districts were the plaintiffs with them in that lawsuit. That lawsuit was plugging along in Gallup, and then another lawsuit was filed here in Santa Fe by the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. And that lawsuit also represents children from a range of school districts. And it raised similar issues, but the MALDEF case was focusing primarily on English as a second language and Native kids. And so eventually these lawsuits were brought together, and in 2015 they were consolidated here in Santa Fe in the First Judicial District Court with Judge Sarah Singleton at the helm. And let me just tell you a little bit more about our lawsuit. So our lawsuit involves 20 children from the following districts: Gallup, McKinley, Santa Fe, Moriarty, Rio Rancho, Cuba, Lake Arthur. That's the Yazzie lawsuit. And the defendants in the Yazzie lawsuit are the state of New Mexico, the New Mexico Public Education Department, and Secretary Hannah Scandera. The Martinez case involves 15 children from Espanola, Zuni, Santa Fe, Magdalena, Las Cruces, Gadsden, and Albuquerque. And same set of defendants. And the focus of both cases is on trying to get a set of programs put into place in the state of New Mexico. And what we want are pre-K, K through 3, summer and after school programs, literacy, college and career readiness, competency, dropout rates. And we want an allocation of high-performing teachers to low-income. We want to improve the allocation of high-performing teachers to low-income and ELL students. One of the amazing things in the state is that the children having the hardest time learning are not getting the best teachers that are available in the state. And we were concerned about funding. And we're concerned that their state was not spending enough money to get these programs that I've just talked about. And so we decided to grab the bull by the horns. And a lot of people talk about the funding formula, Well, that's just sort of moving deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, the reality is that if you don't put more money into the system, you can't buy these programs. The funding formula needs some adjustments, for sure, but you need more money in the system or you're not going to get these programs. In addition, you'll have a huge political problem on your hands if you don't put more money in the system and you just adjust the formula, because there will be winners and losers among the school districts, and that'll be a stalemate battle in the legislature. So if we're going to get anywhere, we need to put more money in the system. And what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at the state spends about almost $2.7 billion on education. That is a shrinking percentage of the state budget. Sounds like a big number, but if you chart this over time, the state's commitment to public education has gone down over time. And what we're looking for is about another $440 million, and we're hoping we'll get that through this lawsuit. Now, how are we going to get that? Well, the lawsuit is based on a very simple idea. Article 12, Section 1 of the New Mexico Constitution says that a uniform system of public schools sufficient for the education of and open to all the children of school age in the state shall be established and maintained. So the question becomes, what does sufficient mean? And that's what we're litigating. And we're litigating it with lots of data. This is one of the most complex. I've done lots of class actions all over the United States. This is one of the biggest lawsuits I've ever been a part of. And because we're getting a mountain of data from the state, and then there are depositions being taken of a range of people from all the school districts that are involved. And Judge Singleton said, look, I don't think that the 12 districts that are being served by the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, I don't think that's representative enough of the state for me, a judge, to make this kind of determination for the whole state. And so she said, I want 23 total focus districts that are going to be the representatives of the entire 89 school districts in the state. So 12 of the 23 are the districts that are from where the plaintiffs reside, and 11 more were selected by the court and the parties. And later, when I have more time than I do left now, so please tell me, I'll tell you who the districts are in the focus groups. But we've been trying to get the focus districts data out of the state. We try to get statewide data out of the state. Then the next phase, which begins in 2 weeks, is the expert phase. We've got something like 20 experts from all over the United States working on this with us to help define what does sufficiency mean. And the question is, in New Mexico, and more generally across the United States, what does that mean? Not as a matter of our relationship to other states, 49 or 50. Yes, we are. I'll give you those statistics if you want them later. But the reality is that what we need to decide is, what do we want from a public education? And it seems to me there are certain basic requirements of citizenship that are required here. And that's what we hope to convince Judge Singleton of, that that's what the state constitution contemplates. And if we can get to that level, and we get her to understand and agree that we want people to be literate, we want people to be able to think about issues and participate in our democracy and find jobs and work in their state. If we do all those things, then we think she will then recognize that we've got to have the programs to get us there. The trial is set in May of 2017. It will be probably 5 to 8 weeks long. Is there a possibility of settlement? We'll have to discuss that with Peter later. We hope so. But the state has been digging its heels in, and the state's position is, number one, money isn't everything. Number two, the school districts haven't asked for the money that's available to them. And number three, the districts haven't spent the money they've gotten very well. I think we won't have much trouble dealing with those defenses, but that's where we are in the case. I have a lot more to tell you about, but my 7 minutes are up.
Thank you, and we will get more granular and also broader probably as the questions come. But Peter, he used the word state several times, and you are not on the hook as the state, but you're the person up here who knows the most about what the state has done to look at this issue over time, what the state has developed as its own analysis and also what the resources are to work with. So maybe you can use that device there and give us kind of a snapshot of there you go. Give us a snapshot from your point of view and your legislative experience, where we are and where we might go headed in a new direction.
Great, thank you, Alan, and thanks everyone for being here, and the Temple and Interfaith and Santa Fe, New Mexico for putting this on. Certainly we've got all the school board, lots of school board members. I don't know if they're all here. Current, former, thank you all for what you do. Again, public service at every level is super tough. We're delighted that you're going to share soon to be Representative Trujillo with us, and are looking forward very much to having her as a member of the Santa Fe delegation. Real quickly, I want to thank my mom. I wouldn't be here without her, so it's always good Nancy Wirth. So a couple of things. I'm going to be kind of rocket through this. I wanted to just put in perspective how serious the current fiscal situation is in the state, because I think the timing of this particular forum has to be placed into the realities we're dealing with. And what's happened in the last year is staggering. In August 2015, we were told we had $293 million in new money. By December, that was down to $235 million. By January 25th, first week in the session, it was down to $30 million. By the last week in the 2016 session, the number was minus $95 million. We built a budget by sweeping agency funds, $129 million of one-time funds to cover that shortfall. And we did pass a budget in January, a $6.2 billion budget for fiscal year 2017, which runs from July 1st of this year through June 30th of next year. The 2017 budget has recurring appropriations for K through 12. I think it was mentioned, the total $2.7 billion. There actually was an increase, a very small increase over 2016 of $6.8 million. It's 44% of the total budget. Estimates today as we sit here are that the shortfall for the current budget year is $500 million, the year we're in. The shortfall for the year we just finished is $200 million. And we're going to be going back into special session because we have to deal with the 2016 shortfall. Figuring out how to deal with the $500 billion shortfall is something we really should do in a special session, but it's an election year, and it's going to be really tough with people digging in. Second thing I want to talk about is the concept of sufficiency from the state level. And I've been there long enough that you've kind of seen the good times with money and then the really bad times. And during the early years that I was there in 2007, we appropriated $1 million to do a sufficiency study. Let's bring in the experts and let's have them tell us what is a sufficient funding for public education. And a report was issued in 2008 that said public schools were underfunded by 14.5%, or $334 million, a number that's not that far off from what Dan is talking about today. They were using, the 14% was using 2007 budget appropriations numbers. Representative Mimi Stewart, who now is in the Senate, introduced two bills in 2009 that attempted to do the two things Dan mentioned. One is fix the funding formula, and Linda's going to talk about all the challenges with the funding formula. And the second thing, it was to pass a bill to raise the revenues, because you have to raise the revenues so school districts don't get hurt with a new change. And she carried two bills that year, one that both passed the House, one implemented a new funding formula for education. The second bill raised $375 million by enacting a new 3/4 cent gross receipts tax, the most regressive tax out there. But it did, that's what was passed in the House in 2009. It passed 37 to 31. It was never heard in the state and Senate. We were right on the precipice of going into the recession. I think, again, there wasn't a willingness to look at gross receipts tax to fund this. Final thing, let me just talk about quickly in my here is the permanent fund. Everyone talks about about the permanent fund and how it fits into this discussion about funding public schools. When we were created as a state in 1912, in our Constitution, we said that the land that we received in the Enabling Act from the U.S. Congress in 1910 would be managed for our schools, and we created the Permanent School Fund. That's now the Land Grant Permanent Fund. And from that fund, we take a percentage that goes to education, not only K through 12, but other educational institutions. Constitution said it was 5%, a rolling 5-year average. That has to be invested by the state investment officer using prudent investment procedures. In 2003, the voters increased the distribution to 5.8%. That stayed in place in 2012 when it went down to 5.5%. This fiscal year, it goes back to 5%. We're talking about 5% of a fund that this year is valued at $14.55 billion. It's one of the largest permanent funds in the country. It's right up there in the list of world countries' permanent funds. It's that much money. We did pass a bill this session, that SJR 3 in the Senate, that would have increased the number back up to 5.8. It wouldn't have actually increased it. It would have given it to the voters to vote on. That bill was never heard in the House. Had that passed, that would have been another $90 to $100 million more per year for public schools. Just want to close by this. It's something I said when I first ran in 2004. Education should be the #1 economic development priority of this state. We've got to understand, and our business community here has been fantastic in Santa Fe stepping up for early childhood, United Way, but we need our business community at the state level to make that same level of investment and understand that until we sufficiently fund public schools, we're never going to move this state forward. Thank you.
All right, so I love the way this logic flow is working. This is almost the way we planned it. Now, Linda, you're going to give us a picture of what it actually looks like when all of the funding issues, the question of sufficiency, the sourcing of the money, the allocation of the money, lands at the level of the school board, and you have to deal with choices and with questions of distribution. You are where the public education actually happens. So tell us what it looks like from your point of view from the Santa Fe Public Schools.
All right, thank you, Alan, and thank you again for having us here, Interfaith Coalition, Santa Fe New Mexico. I would like to recognize my fellow school board members. I believe Susan Duncan, our president, is here. Our vice president, Lorraine Price, is here, as well as another board member, Steve Currio. Thank you for being here. I also want to recognize Barbara Goodwin, who is a former school board member, as well as Mary Ellen Gonzalez, who is a former school board member. We certainly have very active and very dedicated school board members as well as staff. There's a number of staff in the room. Thank you for being here this evening. So first of all, I would like to say, we hear a lot of really challenging things about education. One of the things that we're doing on the New Mexico School Board Association is a program called I Am New Mexico Public Schools. And the goal of that project, which is happening around the state, is to help the public see the really positive things that are happening in our schools. Because there are incredible things happening in our schools. I see some folks here from Pico. We're doing early learning. We're doing all kinds of remediation. So with the limited resources that we've been given, we continue to make lemonade out of lemons. So I do want to just make that very clear. The state equalization funding, which most of us talk about as SIG, SEG, right, is the State Equalization Guarantee. And that was put in place because the Zuni tribe, Pueblo, back in, I believe, the 1970s, 74 to be specific, sued the state. They were the first ones. And they said, we don't get equal funding because local districts who tax themselves higher get more money than we do because we don't have the tax base to fund. So New Mexico is one of only 2 states in the entire country that do this equalization funding, where you cannot get local money for operational expenses. No local money for classrooms, only for facilities. New Mexico and Hawaii is the other one. What needs to happen at this point is we need to reinvent the equalization funding. It's not bad. We want youngsters in Jow, which if you've never driven through is a really small town where used to joke that, they count the cows there. I'm not sure if they do. But we want those kiddos. We want those kiddos to have the same kind of education that youngsters in larger communities with tax base have. So the equalization funding is the right thing for our state to do. But what it does is a student is not considered a unit in and of themselves. Each characteristic of the student adds unit value to that student. So those values are based upon things like what grade are you in? First grade gets more unit value than 8th grade. So it depends upon the grade that students are in. It also depends upon whether the student is receiving special education. It also determines whether or not they are bilingual, if they're English language learners. You get units for that. You get units for at-risk factors, for low income, for poverty level. So all of these factors work into how we identify the unit value of a student. And then you multiply it by a factor that PED gives us every year based upon the money that's given to PED to distribute to school districts. Some of the challenges that we face as a board is that more and more of that money has been going what's called below the line, which means that above the line is money that goes into the SEG and is distributed equally, not equitably, but equally amongst school districts. And below the line is money that PED distributes for the most part. Some of the below, we're beginning to call middle line, things like bus transportation. But below the line money is given out by PED. And one of their arguments I hear is that school districts aren't asking for all the money that they can get. Some of the challenges in asking PED for money is we start doing our budget sometime around October, November. The money's not available until after the session. PED makes it available maybe in July, maybe not. More than likely, it's after our school year has already started and we already have our budget in place. So we ask for the money late, and then we get the money late, and then we have to start the programs late. Our school year doesn't work that way. We need the money when we're planning for the budget in early spring so that we can hire teachers, so that we can hire the staff that we need to administer whatever that funding is. It also tends to come with a lot of strings. And when I say strings, what I mean is it comes with extra testing requirements. It comes with, after you've provided the services, you count how many kids are in the pre-K, or the K3 plus program. How many kids showed up? How many kids stayed? Well, even if you only have 10 students, you still need to pay a teacher, right? So in some cases, you don't get the money back that you've already invested. So there's a lot of challenges with this below-the-line funding. K3 plus, an extra 25 days of school for our youngsters, that's fabulous. Pre-K, excellent programs. But this funding has to be integrated into above the line so that we can get it and we can plan for it and we can depend upon it. So those are some of the challenges that we have. Some of the solutions that we as board members have talked about is that, again, the pre-K money just needs to be included. K3 plus, above the line, give it to us. Tell us that that's what we have to do and we will do it. We want to do those things. Let's reduce some of the money that we spend on testing. We don't have a board meeting that goes by. We don't have somebody that shows up that complains about the excessive testing. So let's reduce some of that. Let's reduce some of the pet projects that are below the line. debit cards, silliness. There's a lot of things that we believe that we can do, and I cannot underscore what Senator Wirth said about the budget. I was listening to the committee meeting in Taos this morning, and it literally almost brought me to tears. And the reason being is that we had educators, Trina was there, talking about programs that are doing really positive things in our classroom. And Senator McSorley gave the speech in these times of budget. And one thing that he said really touched my heart. And it said, we all seem to think that because the sun comes up in the morning, our budget's okay and everything's good. It's not. We're in really dire straits. And we need everyone to come together to make sure that our kids are not the ones who suffer from this challenge.
Okay, I want to remind you there are cards that you can ask a question on. Please do get into the conversation that way. There'll be a chance to have more ongoing discussions when we do a bit of a break. But if you have got a card you want to write, please fill it out and folks will pick it up. Dan, I want to ask you a question about the difference between the political process and the judicial process. Because it seems as if, listening carefully to what Peter says, there are folks in the legislature who understand that funding needs to be increased, but it's difficult to pass those tax increase measures. And we have a governor who has said, even with the budget crisis, never mind spending for education, she's opposed to all tax increases. I'm curious to know, as a matter of your experience in these kinds of lawsuits, can the judge compel more spending? And can the judge determine how the spending would be, how the funds would be created? If you win, what is the product of the victory?
The reason why we brought this lawsuit was because of our perception that the political process was broken. And that this political process, the struggle between people who think that New Mexico should provide more services to our children, and the other side who thinks that we should not raise more revenue to pay for that, was going nowhere. And because of that stalemate, we turned to the judicial branch. We couldn't turn to the executive branch because that's part of the problem. And so we turned to the judicial branch, recognizing that the judicial branch has the constitutional duty to state what the law is. And if the judge states that sufficiency means the programs that I outlined before, that every low-income and ELL child, every Native American child, every child who has a disability, these children are entitled to pre-K, K through 3, summer and after school, literacy, better college and career readiness, better competency of the students when they're done, lower dropout rates, allocation of higher performing teachers to lower performing children. If these essential elements of a sufficient education are determined, sufficient with a small s, are determined by Judge Singleton to be elements of sufficient education with a capital S from our Constitution, then the other two branches of government are required to comply with the Constitution or change it. And we felt that if we can get a judicial ruling about what is sufficiency, and it requires these kinds of programs and necessarily that kind of money that I talked about to implement these programs, then the legislature has to act. Now, what happens if the legislature doesn't act? The court at that point would have the authority to command the executive branch to implement its order and to find the money from wherever they can. And that may mean robbing Peter to pay Paul. And that's going to put in place a very tough political struggle. And at that point, I think something's going to happen. It's also possible that nothing will happen, even if the judge speaks. The legislature and the executive could say, well, that's nice, that's another branch of government. I think we're seeing that happen right now in the United States Senate, which is refusing to confirm a judicial nomination. I think it undermines our sense of civility and representation of government. I think it's bad for the world when that happens. What will happen here, I can't say. But what I can say is that the current stalemate is not okay. We need to take care of our children, and we need to do it by raising revenue. It's that simple. Now, I understand it's hard politically, as Peter's indicated, but, you know, we're told all the time, we can't raise revenue, so let's cut spending. Well, that's not the only way to answer that question. Why not say we're not going to cut spending? I mean, the spending on education has gone from over 51% 30 years ago to what Peter said, 44% today, as a function of the overall budget. That's a lower investment in our kids. So I think that what we need to do is make things more complicated by having a judge issue this kind of order, and maybe we can break the logjam at that point. Now, that's what's happened in other states. We're not the only state that's brought this kind of case. And in other states where this has happened, the judge has given the legislature and the executive branch a little bit of time to work it out, and if they don't work it out, then the judge starts issuing orders. And that's how our system is supposed to work, so that's what we hope will happen here. I just want to add one other thing about politics. This above the line, below the line, it's a political issue, right? Above the line funding trusts school districts to know how to implement it. Below the line funding says, we don't trust your school districts. We're going to tell you the PED is going to decide and dole out money like grants to the school districts, and we'll decide how it gets spent. What's interesting about our case, the Yasi case, is that we have the Gallup School District, the Santa Fe School District, the Moriarty District, the Rio Rancho District, the Cuba District, and the Lake Arthur districts as plaintiffs along with children and parents. And that's because those districts had the wisdom to understand that they need to get on board if we're going to break this logjam. They want more money so that they can provide these programs to these kids. And so it's just another political fight going on above and below the line.
Peter, I think the question comes to you. Imagine we're, after the court case is settled, and between now and then we've still been mired in a debate about dealing with budget deficits rather than surpluses. What would you see happening? You talked about how large the permanent school fund is. Is that the place where people would turn? Is there you mentioned that the gross receipts tax is about as regressive a tax system as any state could design. Would this trigger changing the permanent fund? Would this trigger a larger question about the New Mexico tax structure in general? If you were in a position to write the script going forward, how would you like it to play out?
So it's a great question, Alan, and it's interesting. We've been here before with a $700 million shortfall, I think, in fiscal year 2009 or 2010, and every single tool in the toolbox is on the table. And we didn't have a pledge of no taxes, but we did a lot of politics happen with a bill that was passed and then partially vetoed a line item veto of a tax bill. But I think that the thing I want to say, and I continue to remain optimistic about the legislative leadership on both sides, because we have an obligation to balance the budget in the state of New Mexico. It's a $500 million shortfall. If in fact there's an additional ruling that adds another $350 million onto that number, it's a contingent liability. We have dealt with this before with Supreme Court rulings, with collective bargaining. There was a ruling that the Martinez administration had incorrectly held back payments and the state was ordered to pay it. We figure out how to do it. And at a certain point, and I can say this, I think that there are enough Republicans who have not signed the pledge to never, ever look at any kind of tax tool that we have to do the job we're elected to do as a legislative body. And I would just note that in the final year of the Johnson administration, when he was messing around with the budget, the legislature came in and said, enough's enough. And they finally overrode the veto. That's the tool that we have. It's very tough. There's no question the politics are brutal. But the reality is there's lots of low-hanging fruit. There's $1 billion in exemptions, deductions, all these. When I was first there, we would pass $100 million Christmas tree bills full of every gross receipts tax exemption, cage fighting, you name it. They got their exemption, and they're all sitting there. We need to go back and revisit those. I've been pushing for years for combined reporting. We're the only Western state that allows these multi-state corporations to expense profits to subsidiaries outside of New Mexico and not pay corporate tax. The governor signed a piece of that in 2013 as part of the tax package that was passed. So there's an indication she's willing to look at that. So I do think there's a lot out there. There's lots of liabilities. There's an even bigger one, which is a Texas versus New Mexico water lawsuit, which could be billions of dollars. So again, we deal with this, with the realities that are there. Thank goodness for the separation of powers in the three branches of government. I've come to respect it more than ever. As a lawyer who practices, it's fascinating to see the different roles each branch plays. And all, certainly the legislature pushes its authority, but so does the executive, and the court's there to check it. And so that's a functioning system, and thank goodness for people like Daniel Yohalem willing to get in the trenches and do what he's doing. Because we need to find out what the answer is. It'll be fascinating to see what the appellate courts do when it comes down to the decision in the environment where they're looking at, mandatory 5% cuts being suggested by the governor. Who knows what we're going to end up to get the $500 million, tremendously underfunded judiciary. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But I continue, we have to do the job we're elected to do. And each branch needs to do its job. And I think that's what's going to happen. I doubt we can do it in a special session before an election. That's super tough. But come January, we've got to get it done.
Let me borrow that and ask you a question. There's a bucket of questions that have to do with things that you can probably address better than anybody else. And that has to do with the actual, what goes on in the schools, if we're looking for either better performance or better use of the existing funds. So I'm going to kind of lump it into a generic essay question rather than true, false, or multiple choice, because I don't think any of us could pass those. But the bucket consists of things like charter schools. What role do they play in this situation? What about the teachers' unions? How does that figure into both cost and quality? What about just the sense that we could be spending the money that we do have more effectively and get better results? Not to say that we don't need more money, but Peter was running through some things where we've given away tax breaks that have yielded no positive economic benefit. Could we do better with the funds we've got, and where would you point your finger at in that respect? And then to sum it all up, I have a question that I want to take off from Dan's list. If you were making up the list of things that you were going to go to the court for in order to create sufficiency, is Dan's list your list as a school board member?
We're representing her, so it better be.
We're about to make news here. We find out this could be a news flash, breaking news.
That's a really loaded question.
Thank you. That's what
I do want to just point out that Santa Fe actually, as a board, we committed to a lawsuit. And I traveled around New Mexico with our lawyer at the time, who still provides us services, Tony Ortiz, and we advocated to school districts. We got Taos to sign up. We got Moriarty to sign up. We got 10 districts to sign on to provide support. And then Malduff and the Public Law Center said, hey, we see what you're doing. Would you like to join us? And we thought about each one of them, and we decided that the Poverty Law Center was the lawsuit that we wanted to join. And so that's how that happened. So we're very committed to this lawsuit. What do I think that some of the services? Dan had a great list of services, but let's expand that. K3 Plus is doing phenomenal things. When you've got a good teacher, you've got parents who bring their students for the 25 days. We did a project here in Santa Fe where if the students came to a certain number of those days, and I don't know what the number was, but it was a high number so that they had really good attendance at it, we were able to get them a backpack full of school supplies. So there was an incentive for them to come, and it worked. Lo and behold, it actually worked. And so let's not just do K3 Plus at schools that are struggling and then have to remove it from those schools when they start improving so that they can only drop down again, so that then we can qualify for it again. That's a revolving door. Let's do K3 Plus at all of our schools. We know that we have as much as 30%, at least 30% of our students in every one of our schools could benefit from this type of a service. Let's take it up to K8. We know that our youngsters all the way up to 8th grade could use an extra 25 days of school. I'm an advocate for year-round school, but I don't know if we'll go that direction. But let's take it up to K8. Let's give our youngsters in kindergarten through 8th grade an extra 25 days of school. It does a number of things. It increases the salary that our teachers are making because they're getting paid for those days that they work. They're already working those days in planning and getting ready for the school year. They would be happy to come in and work 25 days. That increases their salary. It also increases the performance of our kids. One of the things that we, and I'm going to give Susan Duncan, our president, credit for this, is that there's a research out there that shows that our youngsters who are not provided access to academic enrichment during the summer are falling behind. So those families who can provide academic enrichment for their children either stay at the level that they were at when they ended the school year, or they go ahead because they're learning new things. Those youngsters who don't have access to academic enrichment go back. So they lose time. So then they both start the school year at different levels again. And then every summer, those kids go back further and further. So providing summer programs for all of our kids, and that K3 plus K8 could be the answer to that. It could be the answer to that academic. So and you also asked the question about charter schools. I'm not going to get on my soapbox about that. But I can say that I found a report from 2012, and it said that we had 173 school districts. Now I know for a fact there's only 89 public school districts. The rest of those school districts are charter schools, and they're getting small school funding in large cities. The small school funding was never intended to be in Santa Fe. It was never intended to be in Albuquerque and Rio Rancho and Las Vegas and larger cities. It was intended for cities like Jaw. It was intended for cities like Edgewood. But because we can't get the money that we need, and I know this is on camera, but we all end up having to play the game, right? It's a shell game. We're trying to move it around so we can get the most money out of the resources that we have. And so we have charter schools all over this state that are small and are qualifying for that small school funding. And it's really, there was a research that the League of Women Voters presented last year where almost 50% of new money in education has gone to charter schools that only serve about 7% of our population. So in my opinion, and in many others' opinion, this is the new form of segregation. It is the new form of economic segregation, and it's hurting our state.
let me just clarify that what's going on is that the state is choosing to treat charter schools as independent school districts. So that's the game that's being played by this administration. They treat them as independent school districts, and because they serve a very small number of kids, they get lots of the benefits that a small school district would get. And that's ridiculous.
Peter, I want to give you a bucket of questions too, and I'm afraid we're going to run out of time before we break, but I want to get a few more things on the table before folks go talk among ourselves. Question came from the group here, and you touched on it briefly, but maybe you can dive a little bit deeper. Who isn't paying taxes that should be paying taxes, and how much would that help the state if we actually constructed got rid of loopholes, got rid of giveaways, and so on? And you made a link in your opening comments between education and economic development, but it works both ways. We are a state that has a very narrow economic profile at the moment. It doesn't have to be that way, but currently we depend on oil and gas, we depend on tourism, we depend on the federal government more than any state of our, on a per capita basis, certainly. How do you actually, is there a model in your mind for not just linking education and economic opportunity, which is clearly the case, but for creating a virtuous feedback loop so that as education getting better makes the economy get better, the way we pursue the economy helps feed education, and we actually stop going in a downward spiral and reverse into an upward trajectory? How would you talk about that from the legislative perspective?
So a bunch of questions there. Let me start with the last one first. You know, when I first came to the legislature in 2005, it was a very different time. There was literally money pouring out the windows. I mean, it's unbelievable. We had $1 billion in capital outlay one year. I was a subcommittee of one on the House Appropriations Committee dealing with cultural affairs, where I sat down with Secretary Ashman and we just appropriated money. And it was a time when we caught up, quite frankly, after 8 years of Gary Johnson vetoing all those bills. There was money, and there was money coming in, and now we've gone in a complete opposite direction. But it takes leadership, and it's really tough in a citizen legislature to have that come from the grass, from the bottom up. It takes leadership from the executive. And Governor Richardson had a whole agenda for a new energy economy, which I was thrilled to come in and carry those bills. And we did some things that some of them were tax involved, a sustainable building tax credit, green building, something I was involved with 2007. Governor Martinez extended that. It's a tax credit, but it really helps encourage green construction. I think that it's going to require that type of vision, and quite frankly, I just don't think we're going to get it in the next 2 years. It's going to be really front and center in the gubernatorial election as to how we move forward. I will say that in terms of who's not paying their fair share, to some extent, I think all of us are not paying our fair share. In 2003, the personal income tax cuts took the rate from 8.2%, I believe it was, down to 4.9%. So if you make $16,000 a year in the state, you pay 4.9%. If you make $16 million a year in the state, you pay 4.9%. We took all the progressivity out of the personal income tax. It's about a $450 to $500 million hit. Interesting, that's the number we need to make up. That's a big one. I think that, I've been pushing this corporate tax loophole. Combined reporting is something that just makes zero sense to me. It's used as an economic development incentive to somehow allow a corporation that sets up with multiple subsidiaries expense profits basically avoid paying their fair share of the corporate tax. And all their New Mexico competitors are right next door, generally limited liability companies and S-corps, pass-through corporations paying 4.9%. They're not paying the corporate tax, but they're paying 4.9%. So I do think that's something that we should fix. We're the last Western state that does that. And it's been fascinating to carry that bill for so long, through so many administrations, and to watch the fiscal analysis go from $90 to $100 million down to next to nothing, and depending on who's in the office and who's writing the report, it's been very frustrating. But I really do think we need to look at that again.
How much do you think we get for that?
Well, it's a good question, and that's the problem. It's hard to know. I think Tom Clifford, when he worked for Governor Richardson in the tax department, wrote a memo to me and estimated it would bring in $90 million in 2005, 2006 when I first carried it. Since then, a whole bunch of experts were hired to give different opinions and different reports, and this started to move nationally, and the responses go rebut the information, and the FIR went down dramatically. So that's out there. I do think that the $1 billion in exemptions and deductions, we just need to revisit them all. We have a tax committee. I'm on the interim tax committee, chaired by Jason Harper, who's a Republican House member from Rio Rancho, who is eyes wide open, doesn't buy this pledge. He knows we need to do this. And again, there's a bipartisan group of us who are willing to do true tax reform. We need the executive at the table. And until that happens, it's going to be very hard. We're at the point, though, we're already, off the cliff, and if Dan is successful in this lawsuit, we're even further. So again, with crisis comes opportunity, and the opportunity is to finally reform a totally broken tax code. So again, that's just a few thoughts.
Let me borrow that microphone. I've gotten the signal that we're down to last list, but rather than ask you one more question, I want to hand the mic to each of you and ask you to pose a question to the group that's gathered here tonight. When you go to break out, what is it you would like them to talk about? What kind of challenge would you put in front of the citizens who are here because they care enough to come out and talk about funding and education quality and the future of New Mexico? How would you frame a productive conversation in the next 15 minutes?
Thanks, Alan. Well, I would like to know what you think a sufficient education would look like. You've heard from me, you've heard what else we think we need, K3, K8, whatever. But it's ultimately up to us as citizens of New Mexico to decide how educated do we want our kids to be, and educated for what? Do we want them to be good citizens? Well, what are the elements of that? Do we want them to have choices in their life? What are the elements of that? So really, if we can get we're going to the judge and trying to convince the judge with experts, but ultimately this is a political question, which if the political system worked, and there was an uprising in New Mexico which said enough, we want our kids to be able to read and have certain levels of competency, and we need to do whatever we need to do to get there. So I would like to know what you think sufficient education means in New Mexico.
So another way to think about that, which I think is a great question, is if you were to step back one step further, you would ask the question that Dan was referring to, which is what do you think public education really is for? What is the point of public education? So we know whether we're doing well enough at achieving that goal, how to define success, and then how well are we doing in achieving that definition of success. Linda?
Okay, so I would ask, we know many of the things that will work for our youngsters. We know not just pre-K, but early learning, or until 5. We know those kind of support systems work. We know that summer programs work. We know that after-school programs work, particularly for those families who have to work full-time and are not able to bring their children home as soon as the bell rings and school is out. We know that our high school students need more hands-on access to what we used to call vocational education, but really is moving even beyond that to, how do we get our youngsters certified in technology? How do we get them certified in basic medical care? How do we get our high school students career ready? What does career ready mean? And my question with all of that list of things, and that's just a start of the list, what are we willing as a community to do and to pay to ensure that that happens?
Questions keep coming, which is good.
All right, one of the things that I have found the most helpful when we're in the trenches and facing these incredibly difficult votes are the town halls that we've done over the years, going out and hearing from all of you about what you think about some of the things that I'm going to have to vote on, Linda's going to have to vote on. So here's my list. I want to know what you all think. There's going to be a push to reimpose the food tax. There's going to be a push to increase the gasoline tax, not only for roads, but with a spin-off for the general fund. There's going to be a push to delay the corporate income tax cuts that were passed in 2013. Do we go back on the permanent fund? I mean, do we go back and revisit the permanent fund distribution, not only for the current beneficiaries, but also do we expand it for pre-K? We've been having this struggle. Do we revisit the personal income tax cuts that I talked about? These are the tools. All of these things I think are going to be on the table. Where the political will is to do it is going to be something we have to look at. Linda just pointed one at me, internet purchases. And this is a wild one because we already have this is great. We've got and others. We have a New Mexico compensating tax. So when you buy something from a different state, you're not paying gross receipts tax on it. The way it was envisioned is that corporations, businesses, and individuals, the tax on the books, are supposed to report their purchases and pay a 5% compensating tax. Well, one of our tax secretaries, Dick Minsner, tried to enforce that against individuals, and the walls came down. People were furious. So we have a law in the book that says you're supposed to pay 5% compensating tax, and then we have another law that says it's not enforceable against individuals. So there are competing laws on the books, but this, again, I think this is going to take another Supreme Court decision. In the Quill case, there's pending. There was a concurring opinion, I think, by Justice Kennedy that basically said internet sales have totally changed the game. I mean, how can you compete as a local business when you're up against entities that are not collecting GRT? So that's my list, and I'd love to hear what you all think.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, we've got our work cut out for us. For the next 15 minutes, what I want everyone to do is get together, and how we'll do it is the people in the front row, and the people in the third row, and the people in the fifth row will turn around and form groups with the people behind you. Groups of just 4 to 6 people, and let's try to answer some of these questions that have been posed to us by the panelists. And also, if we have any feedback that we want to give them.